I am the chess strategist, and today we're going to win another chess game. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of our Rapid Chess Speedrun. Today we're going to be playing a 10 plus 5 rapid game. In our last game, we had a very difficult game where we made a blunder. We were playing the London system against the Dutch, and our opponent took us to the very end. We had an end game where he blundered, and we ended up winning the game because of the blunder that they made. So I'm hoping that we can have a very clean game this next time, and let's just get right into it. And I'm hoping to see if we can get the white pieces in this game. We've had a lot of games with the black pieces. We had an interesting one with the white pieces last time. Today we get the white pieces against Domeg 14, and we are going to play d4. Now d4 is the more positional of white's openings, and usually you get a lot more slow developing positions. You don't get as much tactics immediately. Here we're going to go for the London system with bishop f4 and e3. And the nice thing about the London is you get your bishop on this nice diagonal immediately, and you're able to play very simple development every single time. So you're going to play e3, your knight's going to come to f3, your bishop's going to go to e2 or d3, and then you're going to play your pawn to c3 and your knight here. So all the pieces have their squares. Our opponent here has decided he wants to develop his knight, and we don't want to allow him to take our bishop. So what we want to do is just play h3. So if he plays knight to a5 or h5, we can drop our bishop back, and then we're going to play e3 on the next move, and then continue with our development. Now, when our opponents play c5 in the London, we usually want to respond with c3, reinforcing. And our opponent has gone with c6, which is a less common way to approach the opening, but it's very passive, and I think we can make a lot out of it. He's made this diagonal a little bit more open for our bishop. Maybe he plans to develop his bishop to d6 and challenge our bishop on the diagonal. That's one way that people play. And that could be the case here. Here he's decided to play e6 and then c6 and then e6. So he's creating kind of like a triangle formation, sort of like how we're defending with our triangle. Kind of an interesting way to play the game. I think we should develop our knight first. And if our opponent develops his bishop to d6, like I think he will, I'm going to show you the idea that we have here. And that what we're going to do is just allow him to take on f4 and give us these doubled pawns, which can be useful at controlling the key square e5. That's our goal, is we want to control this e5 square. Eventually we want this knight to jump out there. So we're just going to continue with our development here. No worries in the world. We're going to play bishop to d3. And if he takes like this, we're just going to take. We're going to even pre-move it. Yep. And you're going to notice that we have this e5 square that we're trying to clamp down on. We're trying to have as much control over that square as possible. And you're going to see that by establishing this square as an outpost for our knight, we're going to have a strong attack, and our opponent is going to have a difficult time dealing with all the threats as they start mounting. Now, of course, the traditional London ideas still apply here, and this is one of the many lines where our opponent takes on f4 and we take back with the pawn, and we don't exchange bishops like this, because you just get a less boring game this way. We get a nice attacking game, and we all like to attack, right? So e5 is our key square of this opening. We want to prevent him from playing e5. We want to control the square. And yeah, notice how he's completely buried his bishop. His bishop is an incredibly weak piece over here, just completely buried by his e6 and c6 pawns. So he's decided that he wants to create a double attack on our d4 pawn and our b2 pawn, and there's a few different ways to defend. Now, one thing I don't like usually in this kind of position is playing a weakening move like b3. It just creates a lot of weaknesses, but those weaknesses are on dark squares, and our opponent doesn't really have that many dark squared anything to take advantage of those weaknesses. So that's an option we can do. Another option is dropping our queen to c1, which I actually like a little bit better. I'm going to go with that. It also keeps an eye on this pawn too, which can become a weakness. So our queen is doing a lot of jobs, covering different squares, and eventually we're going to be able to move our rook over, and our queen's going to be free to move about the kingdom. Now eventually we are going to play this c3 move still. It's just creating defenses on this pawn. And our opponent is trying to develop. He's going to have to break with e5 or c5 eventually. So here there's a few different things we can do. I'm wondering if our opponent will see this. One idea is to play c4 here, trying to break in the center, encouraging him to take, and we can get our bishop developed to that diagonal. But another idea is just to reinforce early with c3 and develop our knight. And I like that idea. Our knight can come out to b3 where it's blocking the queen's influence. And it's also restricting c5 from being a possibility. Remember, our opponent needs to get this bishop out for his pieces to be developed properly. This bishop is now trapped. So this move e5 is impossible because we're just going to take and recorrect our pawns and be up a pawn. So he's going to try to go for this c5 move. He can play it on this turn. And we're not going to take. We're going to allow him to take and get this isolated pawn structure. And it looks like he's preparing that move. All right. So it looks to me like our opponent is really trying to play for the c5 break. That's his main idea. Do we need to stop the c5 break? Not really. I mean, it would destroy our center a bit, make our pawn very weak in the center of the board. But he's got a lot of weaknesses of his own, and we can start attacking if we start to exploit them. So, I like developing our knight. If we have more pieces in the game, we are going to be able to attack, defend, do everything better. So I'm expecting c5 here. I'd be very surprised if he didn't play that. Yeah, wow. That is a quite interesting move. Yeah, knight c7 is a very odd square for his knight. It doesn't seem like it's going much of anywhere except for here. And yeah, I think our opponent is making some very odd moves here. We're going to continue. And our opponent really isn't threatening much. One idea is just to get our knight here and try to restrict this move from happening. We want to prevent these pawn breaks in the center of the board. And we do not want to allow him to have any of that. So our knights can jump to these squares whenever we need them to. Knights on these advanced squares are going to be creating lots of attacking potential. And we're going to start getting attacked very quickly here if our opponent keeps wasting time. And yeah, I think our opponent is sort of just moving his pieces around. He's not sure where he wants to castle. He's maybe waiting for us to castle. We're going to go to the king side of the board. We're not going to go to the queen side. It's queen side. He already has a lot of pieces there. So our next move will most likely be castle short. And we can start using our influence over the center of the board by putting a rook here and maybe advancing even f5, creating an attack on the pawn that may be pinned once we put our rook on e1. Alright, and our opponent plays a6, kind of a move that doesn't really look like it does much. We're just going to castle, not waste any time. Our opponent decides he wants to castle short as well. We can just develop our knight. The knight's going to be attacking this bishop. Now that there's one less defender on the bishop, developing these knights to attack the bishop seems quite tempting to me. And also, if we are able to take that bishop and there's no knight to capture, we will be able to have a fork on the queen and the rook. which would be additional material 1. So I'm seeing the attack on this bishop. I'm seeing our opponent has to respond, and the squares that his bishop has available to him if he's going to move it are terrible. I mean, both these squares are not squares you want your bishop to be on, creating a disconnect between the rooks. So I'm wondering what he's going to do once we play this move knight e5. His position is going to start to collapse, I feel. So notice how I was ready to develop my rook to e1 on this move, but I notice he castles. Okay, what does that do? There's one less defender in the knight. So now it's only this knight defending. If we attack it twice, we're going to have so much control over the position. And our opponent his pieces are becoming tied down. He doesn't have very many options. So yeah, his pieces are getting shoved into the corner. I can't imagine he's happy with his position. Alright, so this knight is going to become a defensive piece, defending a lot of these key squares. We're going to just invade. Our knight's going to jump onto the center of the board, onto this e5 square that we've wanted it to go to. Notice how our bishop, it's not doing that much right now, but its job is very simple. It's going to create light squared attacks, which we can follow up on with our queen, making a battery. It's also going to be restricting his knight from jumping to the equivalent square. Now, we've actually decided, we've freed up our f-pawn so it can knock the knight away. But before, this bishop's job was really to make sure that nothing happens in the center of the board. And our opponent has put his rook on the most closed file I can imagine. You don't want your rook on a closed file behind a pawn. It's really doing nothing except defending the pawn, which is already the most well-defended square on the board for him. So I don't think his rook is doing very much on that square, and we're just going to continue with our development here. And we can slowly build up an attack and go for something rather devastating once our pieces all get involved. So I think developing our queen to c2 is a nice square. He's decided to immediately advance his pawn so there's no risk of losing it, and that makes sense. I'm going to develop my rook to e1. And eventually what we're going to want to do is play this key move f5, creating this e6 pawn as a weakness. If he takes, there's going to be the open file, and if he allows us to take, then we're going to have a weak pawn to take. So yeah. Here what I would like to do is start to exchange pieces. I don't want him to take this pawn, or this knight, because he will he'll have a strong, sorry. I don't want to allow him to take because he'll be able to win a pawn. So we don't want him winning the pawn. We're going to take first with this knight. Alright, and now what we're going to do is force open the file with this move f5. If he takes, we can take back with our bishop and exchange pieces. Of course, I'm not even calculating the loss of this pawn here. This pawn, yeah, it's going to be hanging in this line, but our pieces are so active. His pieces are doing absolutely nothing, hiding behind closed files. We are going to have a field day in this position. Not even worried. And he takes, and we take, and he's going to enthusiastically grab our pawn. Notice that his pieces are very restricted. First of all, this rook cannot move to the open file because it will blunder this pawn. Our knight is ready to jump onto this square, creating all sorts of threats on the rook, on the queen if it stays there. So he is in all sorts of trouble. Now, if his queen takes, notice how this pawn is hanging, but he's just winning a pawn. Meanwhile, we're checkmating his king. We're winning the game. Who's really winning in that position? And our opponent is hesitating before taking the pawn. He really isn't sure whether taking the pawn is the best move. And I think that's quite wise. Taking the move very well might taking the pawn very well might not be the best move. But here it looks like he has blundered a tactic. This knight to d7 move is a very interesting one. We're forking the queen and the rook here, and the only defender is the rook. So we would just go queen for rook here, or knight for rook here, anyways. And if since our queen is going to be on this square creating contact with the knight, the pawn won't even be hanging anymore, because if he takes the pawn, we'll be able to take the knight, and we'll be up full rook there. So I feel like our opponent has blundered this fork here, and it looks like we're going to be winning some material. Alright, so our opponent has decided to take the pawn and give us the exchange. That's alright with me. I will take the pawn. Or take the rook. And when our opponent takes here, one thing we can do is immediately play our queen over to this square, give a check, and we will be winning the knight. Alright, so here I want you to notice the developments in the position. One thing we can do is give a check along, or we can drop our queen over to this square here, and we will be blundering, or not blundering, but giving up this pawn here. But notice that once he takes with his queen or his rook, there's absolutely no threat against our king. We can drop our king over to h1, and from there, there's no checkmate, there's no threat, there's not even a check he can give. So dropping our queen over to this square is completely safe. He's going to take with his queen, giving us a nice check. And any checks on the back rank, so we have two rooks defending, the checks are not going to be a big deal. And we are preparing a deadly discovered attack. Our knight is going to be able to jump over to any of these squares, and our queen is going to sail in and create a deadly attack against his king. Alright, so our opponent decides to take. And we have a few options here. Now, notice he is threatening now to take the pawn on g2, which could lead to checkmate immediately. So what we want to do is be careful with our threat. Which threat do we want to make? That's the question. Let's give this check first. Notice how we can repeat. So since we have a draw in our pocket here, the position is not a big deal. His king has no square to go to other than h7, and we can always drop our knight back and create a repetition here. Okay, and our opponent is really losing the plot here. I think that was a terrible move. Okay. Yeah, that was quite poor. That really blows the fun of this position, I feel. It's giving us another piece for no reason. And this should be a clean win. Of course, we have a draw in our pocket. There's a way to get out of this and win, but we have the draw in our pocket. Notice that he has no square to go to other than this one or this one, and we're going to be able to give another discovered check on the next turn. And I believe I see the winning idea here. The winning idea starts with first giving this check with the knight. Then his king goes over. And we're going to be able to drop our knight to this h4 square. This h4 square where it will be giving a lovely defense to our g2 pawn. The g2 pawn attacked twice, defended twice by our king and our knight. And notice how he cannot play g5. Why can't he play g5? If he decides to play g5, this pawn is going to start being weak and we're going to be able to attack. Alright, and here we can just drop our knight back, disconnecting his rook from even accessing the second rank. And our queen is going to drop back here to e5, where it will be creating all sorts of ideas. Mainly, it's attacking this rook, which needs to move. Where is it going to go? Well, preferably it wants to stay on a square where it's defending this square. It doesn't want to allow us to have access to that. And yeah, here we can start developing our rooks to much better squares. Here our rook can create an attack onto this pawn. Okay. And he has some key weaknesses in his position. Now, this pawn is very weak. We can create a tempo on the queen. And his queen has sort of gone off to the side of the board. We can just defend this pawn. We're forcing his pawns to advance. We're forcing him to make concessions in his defense all over the board. And we're going to start using our pieces to attack here in a moment. Alright, so one idea I like is just advancing the pawn. And here he's hoping that we're going to plunder our knight, but we're going to block the attack on the knight from the queen. And notice how a queen trade is always going to be favorable for us here. We are up material, a lot of material. And these positions you can play very slowly like we have, or you can play them quite fast. It's really up to you. You have a lot of choice. You can take. And noticing here an opportunity to pin this rook, and that's one idea that we might go for. Offering a trade of queens. Our opponent has decided to develop his queen back to that diagonal, and yeah, he really wants to play off this pin. That's kind of his idea. We're just going to offer the trade of queens again. So we're not afraid of a queen trade. We're not afraid of any of that. That's something that we really are interested in. And we're going to start invading with our rooks. Our rook on a1 is going to be continually attacking this pawn. His queen has to defend, but he still doesn't go for it, so we decide that we're going to take now. And our opponent has decided to drop his rook over. We're going to offer a trade of rooks. And we do go for the trade of rooks. Opponent drops his queen over. And our pawn is well defended by the knight. Our rook is going to get out of the way of his queen. And I am noticing here the opportunity to drop our rook all the way back and pin the queen. That's the goal. We want to trade our queens. So next move, we're going to give this check to the king. He blocks. We are going to now develop our rook. And our queen is going to go to b8, and we're going to threaten checkmate. And we're going to see if our opponent gives up his queen or if he's going to play very stubborn and allow us to checkmate him. We'll see. Okay, and our opponent has decided that he is interested in going the other way. So what we're going to do is drop our queen to b8. He might give us this check here on e3 where we'll be able to step our king away. And from there, he'll have one check on this square or on this square where we can block with our knights. And he won't have any more checks after that. Our knight will come in and save the day, guard the king on g1. And checkmate is looming for our opponent. He is going to have to deal with the idea of queen h8 checkmate, which is looming over him and is an unstoppable threat. Yes, and our opponent decides to step over his king, but that is not enough to defend him against checkmate. And he offers a rematch, but we're not going to go for it. Okay, very interesting game. We played the London system. We developed our pieces, and we allowed our opponent to take on f4, giving us the clamp of pawns on e5. And we played very simple chess developing. We got our pieces to nice squares, and we played on the idea of restricting his pawn breaks. His pawn breaks c5 and e5. We want to control these squares so that he cannot advance his pawns, and we disallowed that. He didn't get to play these moves. These are moves that would have greatly improved his position, and we got to play out our pawn break. Here he was a little bit scared of the attacking possibility, so he decided to go with a rook move, but in doing so he allowed us to get our pieces active, and of course he was able to create some counter threats, but what we saw was that these counter threats weren't game breaking. There's ways to defend, and we spotted a critical resource being the draw, knowing that we can drop this knight, this square, and back over and over and over again, and that would be a draw no matter what. So there's no way to lose in this position. We just have to find the winning idea, and eventually we did find the winning idea, which was going to h4, defending the square here, and then from there we just developed our rooks. We got our pieces wiggled around a little bit, and eventually traded pieces down, and we got into a position where we calculated it all out, and there's no defense for our opponent, and we won the game. So yeah, I feel like that was a rather clean victory. We were able to demonstrate some key concepts in the London system, and I do hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you have a good rest of your day.